Well, our first speakers are Leigh Whitcomb with Imagine Communications and Ed Dengler with eTrans Research. And I'll let you guys fill in the background instead of reading a dissertation.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our talk. I know it's sort of just after lunch, and you might be going through that post-lunch nappy phase here. So if you do fall asleep, just keep the snoring to a minimum, please. That's all I ask. My name is Leigh Whitcomb. I'm with Imagine now for 27 years, so been in the industry for a while.
And my name's Ed Dengler, and I'm actually used to run a security company, which actually did managed security for financial firms, mining companies, hospitals, and so forth. And I ran that company for over 10 years.
Okay. So what are we going to cover this afternoon here? We're going to go over kind of why this matters, why it's important. We're going to talk about some of the threats, the threat models, and then we'll get into some of the more practical things that you can sort of do to help defend your IP-based plant. And also we'll talk a little bit about what the JTM and SMPTE are sort of doing in this area to sort of help you guys. So what's changing a lot in the industry? So as we say over maybe 5 years ago, we had it in our SDI plants. We had some of the management part was sort of IP networks, but the core essence was over sort of SDI and so forth. So it was a little more harder to get access. As we move now to our IP-based systems, we have both our essence data and our management, which are all going through IP switches. Everything sort of needs real-time control. We're now integrating more systems where you had more islands. Now these islands are getting connected, and we're sort of getting more access to the outside. So before, where you had your facilities were much more not connected to the outside, they're now much more connected. So with all these, are sort of increasing your threats. You still have multiple vendors, so with different vendors, and you've got connections between them, you have different protocols, there's various sort of security issues with some of the protocols, so there's sort of vulnerabilities there. In a lot of facilities now, you have less people, so you're sort of having to do more, so you have like less time to work on these problems, and this is an important problem. So with this, you've sort of got with this greater integration, you've got sort of more chances of people attacking you, connections to the outside, which are making it harder or easier for people to attack you, and then you've sort of got less resources to sort of work on this. So it's kind of almost a perfect storm coming. So, I mean, sort of some reasonably obvious sort of implications here. I mean, if someone attacks your facility, they can sort of take down your channel or take down your station, which will affect your ad revenue, your reputation. You could have data stolen, so like, will someone maybe sue you for that? Someone could sort of replace your content, which again goes to your reputation. So lots of different issues that you can have.
One of the reasons why this is getting important is that this has happened before in other industries where greater integration with IP has led to problems. In particular, when security cameras, which used to be direct connect, went to IP-based systems, all of a sudden the camera systems and the alarm systems were actually accessible by various groups that wasn't thought before. Another one here is VoIP. When VoIP first came out and everything else, people were saying, oh, this is great, fantastic. When I was running the security company, we actually did an audit on a big bank and actually managed to turn their phone system into an eavesdropping system in addition to hacking and crashing the primary PBX and the phones. Why? Because everything was just available from any desk. On top of that, I mean, there's been instances happening out here. For example, Sony had loss of media and everything else when it came on through. There's the ability to hijack Wi-Fi. It's amazing how often organizations, in order for ease of access and so forth, have put in Wi-Fi components into their systems. Yet those can be connected to, and then from there hijacked on into the organizations. And one of the interesting ones was that in 2016, a study was said where 35% of traditional TV companies actually suffered a cyber attack. Now that actually is more than just simply somebody trying to scan them, because that's always occurring. So if you have anything exposed to the internet, this is actually getting some progress into the organization.
Okay, so just looking at sort of your a typical station. I just out of curiosity, how many people are looking to actually roll out an IP-based workflow, say in the next year or so? Okay, so a few hands. And how about maybe in the next 2 or 3 years? Okay, so we definitely have some people that are looking for some real applications here. So just looking at, just for the rest of the talk here, kind of what a typical network would look like as you're going, say, to use 2110 and IP-based stuff. So, let me get the thing here. So historically, you've got your control, so you've got your switch that's sort of handling all your management. As we're moving now to IP, we have our essence switches. So assuming that you're using something like 2022-7, you've got your primary switch or your blue switch, you've got your secondary switch or your red switch, you've got various end devices, which might be -7, so connected to both. They may have sort of separate or out-of-band management, so they have connections up to the management switch. Some of them may only have in-band control. And so now we have our management switch actually has to be connected in through the data essence ports, and so you can do the control in-band for some products. You've got, say you're doing some OTT services, you're going to be getting the various feeds off the switches. You have some sort of maybe firewall. On the outside, you've got your various viewers who are accessing it. You may have, like, your station engineer wants to be able to log in and check the status of some equipment or even change some controls. So you've got possibly outside control from your own people, but it's on the outside. Then something you may also have as these systems are getting more complex and you have less staff is that vendors will be sort of logging in to help debug and troubleshoot issues. So you might have a computer here running TeamViewer, and so that a remote vendor can log in to the network to be able to sort of help debug and configure and access their equipment. But on the sort of on a threat side now, from this computer, if some sort of nasty person logs in, from here they might get access to the management and then to the rest of the system. So where this adds extra sort of power and useful for debugging, it also adds sort of extra vulnerabilities.
Basically, from a security perspective, this has been one of the classics, is if I can exploit one system, from there I can hopscotch onto other systems, which, you know, people didn't say, well, you don't have direct access. Yeah, but I went through 3 other systems to make it happen. We did one mining company where our entry point was hijacking their satellite uplinks. And from there, we were able to access the entire internal infrastructure. So what can be attacked? I mean, one of the things that we're going to be talking about here is that as an organization, you got to start thinking about what's called a threat model. Because you're not going to necessarily be concerned about everything that possibly can happen, everything else. You got to be considered reasonable. What can we expect? What's going to be the damage on this? How much do I want to prevent this? So forth. And really, you're looking at effectively 2 things. So attacks that are directed at the equipment itself. So if you have some service that's kind of exposed to the internet, it can be attacked, or maybe a bad actor internally can go after one of the subsystems. Or typically another one is attacking the infrastructure. So I want to attack the firewalls, the switches, the VPNs, the systems that control all the communication around and make that happen. And one of the big questions here is, do you have anything exposed? One way of dealing with a law of security is put it into a concrete bunker. If it has no communication to the internet, then nothing can necessarily attack it. On the other hand, more and more organizations, as you have your websites, you have streaming media, your news sites are exposed to the internet. Those are all vulnerable, potentially, to outside people trying to come on in and take over the systems, and from there move on. So what you really do need here is you need a model to consider the things. And so one of the aspects on here is you got to consider what attack surfaces are obvious and non-obvious for your infrastructure. So for example, control systems, any sort of control application, everything else is potentially accessible unless you can isolate it. But even if you isolate it, if one of those systems is a bad actor, it can potentially be used to hijack other systems. Anybody here actually saw the announcement by Bloomberg about 2 weeks ago about the Supermicro things? Once again, nobody knows whether or not it's real or not. There's still a whole bunch of discussion going around there. But there's an example where potentially a piece of equipment that a lot of vendors have based their systems on could potentially be compromised and then used as an attack platform onto your organization. The next one after here is non-obvious ones, such as the data side. Now that the data side is actually getting more IP-based, we could disrupt it by sending out false information, by direct connection in there. Has that side, if you have 2 ports on your appliance that's utilized within your organization, is the data side also as secured as the control side? And as I said, everything exposed from the outside or indirectly accessed. So examples on here is, hard-coded things that could potentially be problems. And in fact, Leigh will later on in the talk be talking about an example being done this summer where a number of these actually showed up. So, for example, equipment that has hard-coded or default passwords that never changed. It was amazing when Wi-Fi was really starting to come out, driving by the 401, just seeing how many systems exposed from the 401 you could attach to. It had the factory default settings. There could be backdoors installed if there's a malicious actor dealing with some of the systems, or if you had some programming done internally in organizations, maybe somebody added that in. Basically, you can get attachments and such that can be decoded that they basically can launch from your workstations into the organization. Sometimes it's a case of protocol brittleness. How many people here have actually, who've developed equipment that deals with encoding and decoding of video and all that sort of stuff, have actually tested it in a very hard way to make sure that there's no edge cases? And in fact, one of the areas you'll hear about is called fuzzing, which has been applied for about the last 2.5 to 3 years. And it has been finding problems with complex encoders and decoders that don't deal well with edge conditions. And so on and so forth. For example, the failure to upgrade. It's amazing how many organizations that I've done security audits on that, I see switches and such that haven't been upgraded for 5 years. So I just go on Google. How do I break into this system 5 years ago? And I get an answer. So on the infrastructure side, you can get things like remote cameras, social media. We can also just do denial of service. Has anybody here dealt with a denial of service attack where you basically have like 10,000 computers trying to basically flood your organization and preventing anybody from utilizing it, or taking down the web servers because they can't deal with the volume of traffic? Another fun one is cascade failure, where basically one system goes down and the next system goes down and everything else. Interestingly enough, this actually happened to RIM, where they had an equipment failure, which then ended up being a cascade failure. But that equipment failure, there was still suspicion that it could have been started by an actual attack. What would happen if your network traffic starts flooding? Like basically, when you have direct physical connections, nobody can kind of slow that down. But if you have broadcast IP happening on a fairly fast switch fabric, it can still be potentially flooded and actually start having timing problems. On the external side of this, as I said, distributed denial of service attacks, web attacks, things like injection attacks that can occur. These are typical issues that have happened up on many a financial firm or other company. I don't know if anybody knew, but Bank of America had a fabulous one where you could actually look at anybody's bank statement. Right? What do you have, making sure that somebody can't look at all your content that you want to try to lock out? So it said malicious payloads. This is basically when we start looking at things like emails coming on in or other content coming. Somebody ships you a video. If your video decode system has a problem, that could potentially launch a virus internally into your infrastructure. Sometimes, as I said, communication bottlenecks, which allows for the denial of service. But even cloud access. Is it actually locked down properly? Are the passwords and accounts set up and things? We broke in through one hospital in under 5 minutes, just Googling email addresses and passwords. Googling email addresses for the organizations and using the top 100 passwords. It allowed us to break into 2 accounts, including a VP's, that then allowed us to start launching attacks against the rest of the infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah, so on the cascade side, I mean, if you can, if someone can sort of, say you have a 10 gig link and someone can sort of convince the switch to send extra traffic. I mean, if you try to put 20 gigs down a 10 gig link, then you can disrupt all the signals on that path, so you can have a lot of interactions there. With the social media, sometimes you may have taking Twitter feeds and stuff and putting that into your programming. If some person were to sort of send various nasty codes that might break some protocol there to try to get access to your system, so a variety of ways there. One very sort of specific for our industry, so in our timing system, so as we move from our legacy black system, which was very secure, as we move now to using 2059 and PTP, there's various ways of you could have rogue masters or change the PTP domain, or what happens if some person changed one of the essence multicast to match the PTP essence multicast. I mean, that would freak out a lot of devices. And we'll sort of come back to PTP in a bit.
Now, note that this is actually has occurred in other protocols like DNS, boot up sequences and such, where malicious devices on a network basically can hijack the signal and create problems.
So we touched on TeamViewer earlier, so it means that this is a very powerful debugging technique, but I mean, TeamViewer has various security issues, and it also does, having that allows possible access to quite far internal to your system. I guess it's back to you.
So one of the aspects in here that sometimes organizations don't take into account is what's called social engineering. I broke into one hospital by pretending to be somebody from TELUS, and I got access to their phone systems and their computer systems for a good 30 minutes with nobody else around. And this sort of thing that basically, how does your organization deal with your equipment? How important is it? Back to the threat model and everything else. Do you want somebody to be able to walk in off the street and have access to these systems and potentially shut them down or create problems? Sometimes the whole issue back here is about rogue actors. If you're hiring staff and everything else, maybe somebody is getting paid off to inappropriately access. It doesn't mean that you have to do a complete lockdown, but is it completely open so that anybody can get access? In one organization, we were in one of their reference rooms, and from there, we're able to basically access the rest of the organization. There was no separation of the networks, no ability to limit, because at that area, I shouldn't have been able to access anything more than limited resources. Now, one of the things that we should look around here, so this is actually from my experience running a security company and dealing with finance firms and everything else. So if we're going to take away kind of 2 points from this talk, this is one of them. Most organizations are not too bad about preventing problems. Today, firewall used to be oh my God, that's a whole new device. Everybody has one today. People have VPNs. People have a lot of security things. So organizations have spent money on trying to stop a problem in the first place. On the other hand, problems can still arise, and this is where organizations have tended to fall down on. And the analogy here for dealing with your fire in a house. Nobody wants to have a fire in a house, so you do all sorts of things to prevent it. Make good wiring, don't have curtains near the stove. However, you still have a smoke detector, you still have a carbon monoxide detector, and then you have a reaction plan. Get out of the house, call the fire department, deal with the thing, and then go back to prevention. What caused that fire? How do I stop it? Most organizations we have found have very little visibility into the current running operations of their systems to know that there's things. We had one organization come to us, hey, we think we've been hacked, okay? Show us your logs. Your logs go back 6 months. You've been hacked for 6 months, right? They had no idea. The only reason they detected the problem was their network got slow. So if the person who was attacking was smart, they never would have seen it. So one of the things we probably want to recommend here, which is I think part of the things that's going to be hopefully coming along as the industry evolves and matures, is that there needs to be this sort of monitoring side. So as I said, we had some of the items in here. You can always look on it, on how to prevent the problems. And the next one here, but the detection. So basically, do you have systems that collect information from all the various systems? Manufacturers, do you actually produce logs of information that's useful to basically, so somebody could actually say, hey, a problem has occurred in here. I'm seeing too many errors. I'm seeing too many attempts to access. I'm seeing a flooding where I'm not expected to see. I'm seeing some kind of issue that allows for the organization to have a detection methodology and then a reaction plan. By the way, organizations that have been hacked traditionally have probably been scanned or attempted to be hacked into probably for months before the actual attack succeeds and enters.
Okay. So looking at a few more more specific things that you can do to help secure your system. So as I mentioned earlier, the timing in your PTP system is a very critical infrastructure. If your timing fails, worst case you're off the air, best case you're still probably quite crippled. So protecting your PTP or your 2059 is a very important thing. So with PTP, it's designed to be a very, you can have a very ad hoc network and different things can become masters, and that's a very cool and useful capability of 1588. For our application in our space, we want to have a very engineered network. So when we're designing our PTP system, we have very specific grandmasters we've selected. We want them to be the grandmasters and only them being the grandmasters. So a few techniques you can do. So for your switches, you want to enable boundary clock mode in your switch. which has some good timing reasons, but one of the very powerful features that it enables is most switches have something which is basically a master-only mode. So what you can then do is you can basically say, this port only acts as a master, it will not act as a slave, and so if some person were to connect a rogue master to that port, the switch will ignore it. So that's a very sort of powerful way to help prevent things from rogue masters and some of the issues.
Now note how this is here, part of the threat model. Threat model here is somebody else could pretend to be a master. So that's an important one within our infrastructure. Therefore, we're willing to do the extra work, such as lockdowns, to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And then for your slave devices and your endpoint devices, what you can have is sort of whitelist or at least alarm saying, I know I'm only supposed to connect to these two grand masters. That's how I've engineered my system. And so if I'm not connecting to one of those masters, it can report an alarm. Also, as part of the monitoring, the switches have a lot of telemetry, so if they do see master on a port that they're not allowed to, they'll report it up. On the end devices, you can sort of monitor how much sort of say PTP jitter and how much the performance is. And so if you see that increasing, that may be indicating that some person is trying to flood on the PTP multicast or something. So there's a lot of telemetry and monitoring that can be done from the slave devices and from the switches. So.
And that gets back to the monitoring side. Is there actually a system in place to actually monitor that and alarm when it starts, which maybe not necessarily wrecked completely, but is actually getting off kilter?
Okay, so what are some other things that are going on in the industry? So the JTM has sort of started to look at security, and so what their goals have been is sort of to produce some recommendations that sort of make a difference, sort of focusing on low-hanging fruit and keeping it simple, because a lot of either end users or manufacturers know, like, this is a problem, but it's almost like paralysis. What do I do? What's my first step? And so what the JTM is trying to do is, like, let's start with some baby steps. Let's get some of the low-hanging, easy stuff, and let's sort of get going on this. So what has their progress been to date? So they've sort of identified that PTP is definitely an area that needs some work, and so they've reached out to SMPTE to sort of look into that. They've also identified that on our control protocols, that the APIs are something that we need to sort of look at. So they've reached out to AMWA to say, please sort of work on that. So AMWA's doing some work on that. And they've also put together a sort of draft vulnerability scan, which we'll cover on the next slide here. So at IBC this year, we had another one of the IP Showcase events, and we sort of had a very unique opportunity. So in preparation of the IBC and the IP Showcase, basically we had all the vendors get together in August in Wuppertal, Germany. So we basically wanted to build up the IP Showcase. So what this had is we had sort of the largest collection of IP equipment ever assembled. So we had 65 different vendors, we had 165 pieces of unique equipment, all in the same room with all the engineers who could drive it, and we sort of wanted to take advantage of this. So what we did at the event is we sort of did the industry's first sort of industry-wide use of a vulnerability scan. And so sort of in the background, not to interfere with the event, is one person was driving some software to basically probe all the different devices on the network. And what we were trying to achieve there is we've sort of come up with a methodology, and we wanted to make sure, does this methodology make sense? Was the tool that we were selecting a good tool for doing this? And was the overall approach something that's effective and that can be rolled out to either future events or to sort of companies in the end? So some of the goals there, so we collected data that was for each vendor. So one person who was a neutral person basically collected all the data and then shared on a one-by-one basis with each of the vendors, because we didn't want other vendors to know what are vulnerabilities in different vendors. But we wanted to make sure that each vendor got some education saying, oh, here's some issues with your equipment. It also gave the vendors a sort of a common starting point. A lot of people say, I want to work on this, but where do I start? So now at least there's a tool set that they can use to say, I mean, it's not going to solve all the world's problems, but at least it's a starting point that they can start from. And
sometimes awareness is a starting point to get things moving along.
Yeah. And also the idea we're just about to roll out that end users and vendors will have access to the same toolkit, so you can use this in your lab. So when you have new versions of your software, new products, you can test that out. Or as an end user at a station, you can run this scan yourself. So it won't find all your problems, but at least it finds a lot of issues out there.
Now, just as a quick note, this was, according to Leigh and everything else, this is based on OpenVAS, which is a vulnerability scanner. The disadvantage is that it'll be a very generic scanner, so it's going to be looking for kind of non-industry specific issues, just generic issues all around. And if you get to the issue page, So one of the things that the industry should be doing here is actually expanding upon that to add industry-specific issues so that can be a better useful tool. And remember we were talking about some of the threat model and everything else? Well, lo and behold, actually running this scan on 165 pieces of different equipment ended up showing off the ones we were talking about. These are all prototypical issues that have been seen in vulnerability assessments and organizations over the last 20 years.
And if you go to on the VSF website, there was a presentation that detailed the exact methodology and results. So if you're interested, as part of the IP showcase, that presentation will be available, and there will be at other events some additional presentations on the scan that was done. So, yeah. So what's SMPTE doing, since this is a SMPTE conference? So as I mentioned, the JTM has reached out to SMPTE to basically look at PTP specifically. So given that 2059 is a SMPTE standard, this made a lot of sense. And given that PTP is a very critical part of your infrastructure, it also made sense. Now this is a very focused effort. So we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're looking at a very, very specific part of the problem. So we want to basically be able to come up with some sort of recommendations and some actions to move forward. Now specifically with, say, PTP also, it's used in many industries. So we're also trying to leverage the fact that in the finance industry, in the power industry, in the telco, they use PTP. They also have security concerns. So we're trying to leverage that, not reinvent the wheel, but we do want to come up with some very sort of tangible and actionable items. So in sort of conclusions here, I mean, the threats are getting worse because of the better connectivity and stuff. You've got a lot more opportunities to be attacked. By using some very simple prevention methods and using sort of best practices out there will go a long, long way. As we saw in that scan, there's a lot of kind of obvious things a lot of equipment suffers from, so these can easily be corrected. Do you need to do monitoring? So not only do you need to do the prevention and you need to do the detection, but you also sort of need to monitor your systems. And to say that SMPTE and JTMM and AMWA and other groups are working on some very sort of actionable and concrete solutions to help move the industry forward, to help sort of push the vendors and everyone along. Thank you. What's that? Oh, okay.
If you have questions, we'll be after the three presentations, so we'll hang around for a few minutes.
Yeah, and I'm here all week, so you can also stop me in the hall too if you have questions.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.